Hello everyone, Robert Prine, Systems Architect for AmpThink here, to talk to you about IPTV systems, specifically Cisco Vision 6.3. We're going to be talking about everything from system configuration, system operations, API control, video head-end. You'll see that all of the videos here are broken up into individual pieces in a series, but the goal at the end of watching all of these videos is for you to be comfortable with all of the different parts and pieces of a Cisco Vision deployment from head-end to edge. Hello everybody. So we're going to start with something that I typically call a tour of the system. We're going to look through what Cisco Vision is when you first log into it, what tools you're presented with, and just a cursory overview of the user interface for the entire product. After that, we're going to start doing specific deep dives into individual parts and pieces. So, the first thing that we're going to do, so this is a live production system. Obviously, for the SoFi folks in the building, you will note that it is your system because that's where we're filming this right now. So when you first log into Cisco Vision, you'll actually be presented with a login screen. Every user should be assigned a set of credentials. Recommendation typically is that every user has their own credential that you don't share between individual users. There are a couple of really good reasons for that. One is the system does log activities from individual users. This way, if there's an issue, you can always track what actions happen based on what user actually did them, which can be very, very helpful. When you first log into a Cisco Vision user interface, you are presented with the Content Management tab. Basically, this is the archive of every piece of content that has been uploaded into your system. You can sort it by a variety of things: the name of the file, the MIME type, the size of the file, modification date, how long it is, which really only applies for video files, and resolution. This can be super useful if you're trying to track down a specific size of content. Let's say, for example, you had a score bug that was 240 by 30. You could find that very quickly using resolution. This will also let you see all of your content in two different views. You can see it both as a list, which is the detail view, or you can sort from this button in the top right and see everything as a thumbnail, which just allows you to do a quick preview of that piece of content. The search bar will quickly allow you to identify the content based on the search terms, and that search works both in detailed view as well as in thumbnail view. We'll get into a lot of these other items, but the main overview for the Content tab is this is where the library of content is collected. It's where playlists of content are built, organized, and updated. It's where tags can be assigned. Tags are just a quick way to sort content. You can either apply tags to content when you upload that content initially, or also after the fact. Once a piece of content is in the system, you can add a tag to it afterwards. You can also build workspaces, which are really just a way for you to organize specific subsets of content based on whatever workflow that you need. And then we'll dig into some of the details about the rest of these items when we circle back to the Content tab. Second, Device Manager. If anybody is familiar with Cisco Vision in earlier iterations, this is going to be mostly a new tool, but what's worth pointing out is everything that previously lived in the management dashboard. This gets into IT management tools, system status, commands that can be sent and used to control individual DMPs. All of those tools live here. The other nice thing about this, apart from just those tools, this is where you can see the status of your media players, where you can get active thumbnails of the content that's running on that media player. There's a lot of really cool, very powerful stuff in this menu, and we will get back and do a full deep dive on this one. But I'll show you a couple of quick things. So we'll identify this DMP here. You can either do a search on the location name, the description, the IP address, or the MAC address. So in this case, everything that we've set up for the demo lab is named around demo, so we can just do a quick search for a location. It's going to show you some really important basic information about your media players. So here we know that's a CVUHD DMP, that's the model of DMP. Its IP address, its MAC address, and then we can look at a couple of little other items. So the firmware version that's running on that media player, the power status of the TV, and the health of the DMP. That green light is a really great indicator of what's going on with your system. Every DMP is either going to be green or red. Typically red means that there's a configuration problem or a connectivity problem, but we'll dig in a little bit more later. So this drop-down that you see at the top towards the left side of the center is where you can actually send commands against individual DMPs. There are a couple of these that are not used very frequently, but we'll do a full deep dive about what each one of these is, what you use it for, and what it can do. So that's specifically the search bar. Another quick function I want to show you is that in the Find Devices, you can also filter. And you can provide a variety of sort of like macro filters for media players. So if you wanted to find all of your DMPs that were in a faulty state, you could just do a search here, where you select the DMP health as the field, the value is critical, and hit OK. And then all of the critical DMPs in your facility will automatically populate here. Now, the other really useful thing about this tab, just as a general note, is the ability to do previews of content and just get thumbnails of individual DMPs. Now, a big note about preview content, DMP does have to be in a group and a zone. We'll talk about what that really means as we get a little bit deeper into things. But once a DMP is a part of a group and a zone, you can then move from the detailed view into a thumbnail view, enable visual monitoring, and that will actually show you a current thumbnail of the content running on that DMP. The refresh button here will grab a fresh screenshot. So if you're playing video, for example, and you just want to make sure that it's not frozen, this is a really great way to do that. You just refresh the frame. If you see that the content is updating, that gives you that information very easily. So we'll do more of a deep dive when we circle back specifically to the device management tab. Script management is our third icon in the center here, that play button. And the script management is really where you handle all of the content controls for your facility. Basically, the way that we can look at the inheritance for configuration is you start with a media player. The media player gets associated with a location. A location is an object that holds all of the information about the TV, what the TV type is, what kind of controls you're using, what kind of resolution it requires. And then that location can be put into a group. That group can be put into a zone. And then that zone and group can have actions assigned to it in a script. So these scripts that you see here are really just ways to assign actions to DMPs in groups and zones. We have a script set up here for the purposes of our demo. So we can, just like we could with DMPs, just like we could with content, you can search for whatever the descriptive name for your script is using that search bar. So if we go to our edit button, we can take a look at all of the stuff that's currently configured for this demo script right now. On the left-hand side, you see sequential states. That's each individual content state that's configured in this script. In the center, you'll actually see the zones and groups that have been assigned to that state. And then if you look at those zones and groups, you can see the actions that we've applied. So in this case, this script starts with a blank state. This is a general best practice in Cisco Vision, just because the media players typically take 30 seconds to a minute and a half in order to actually get their content. If you're sending out the script to a larger number of DMPs, I typically pad the space. So, a good example would be at SoFi. You have, well, by the time you add the performance venue and you add the retail district, you're going to be well above 3,000 total DMPs. If for some reason you wanted to script all of them, I would give that blank state a little bit more of a pad, because it's going to take a little time for the script and programming to propagate out to all of your DMPs. But for a script that's running like 1 or 2 DMPs, it's typically very fast. This blank state can be left for 30 seconds to a minute. Now, what I'll note here is there are 2 different ways that you can configure a state. You can either let it be manual, which is you trigger it yourself using the Cisco Vision dashboard, or you can set it to function off of a timer. The timer basically means that when the script starts, this blank state runs for 190 seconds and then automatically moves to the second state. In this case, we're calling this state TV on. We have the demo zone, which is a group in a zone that just contains this DMP for our purposes, and we've assigned a TV power on action. So the script starts, waits 190 seconds, the TV in that group powers on, and then 15 seconds later, it transitions to the next manual state, and it stops there. Once a script gets to a manual state, it will stay on that manual state until you change it to something else yourself, manually. And you can see that's exactly what we've got here. We've assigned a full screen video or mixed. That's just a template that lets us put up a full screen graphic or a video channel. And we've assigned a content playlist named demo background. This playlist just has one item. It's this AmpThink logo that you see right here. We will start digging in as we get into basic and advanced scripting into all of these individual states that we have configured. But you can really put up a lot of different types of presentations, and you can customize the actions and templates for your screens based on whatever you need for your venue. Typically, when we do system commissioning, we build a lot of templates for day one, but you've got the freedom to look through the templating tool and create presentations that'll apply for whatever your creative teams want to put up on screens. And we'll talk a little bit later about how you actually create and modify these templates as well. So I'm going to just exit out. That's the editing screen that shows you how you can modify and view a script. But from the overview page, when you first click in to script management, you can see every script that is currently running, when that script started, and then you can actually control the states. So the center channel here, each one of these is a play button that will allow you to manually initiate a state. So if we want to move from this background to a logo loop, we can just hit the play button, and you'll see that the content immediately updates. And we can go back and forth between each of the individual content states from here. So if we wanted to go back to the background, we can initialize the background, right back where we need to be.
Quick question, and I know we're going to dive into this deeper later, but
Yep.
whenever you interrupt or you manually switch to a certain state in a script, that will break any scheduled action, right? If it's on a scheduler?
No. We'll get into the scheduler later, but just so everybody in the room is aware of what Brandon's talking about, there is a scheduler which allows you to create a timed event. So in other words, you can pick a specific time to run a script, and in that scheduled event, you can also schedule specific states to run at specific times. So not only can you start the script up at a particular time, but you can schedule each of these actions to run at different times. No. So one of the best practices there, and I think we've talked about this before, you can't have timers in a script that you're scheduling because the timers will break your ability to schedule it. But let's say, for example, that we had scheduled background to run at noon, right? And I moved to URL or video with logo. When I get to noon, the script is going to go back to the background state based on the timing. As long as you haven't created any timers, one thing that you will note is that you can take a state in the script that's originally configured to be manual, and you can click it over to a timer. If you did that, you would absolutely break your timed state in the scheduler. And a couple of other things in this tab. So we can look at all of the times that the script has run, when it started, when it stopped, what its status was. This can be really useful if you're trying to troubleshoot, like let's say that you had a scheduled script that needed to run every day at a particular time, but that you had reports that that script was not running correctly. You could come here to take a look at the instance and say, hey, do I even see that that script started at a particular time? Is it something other than just running, or completed? For example, blocked, right? And we'll talk about what would be a script blocking so when we get into advanced scripting. And then the final piece here is validation. One of the things to note is that scripts can't have conflicts. basically, if you have a media player in a location and you want to run content on it, and then you had a separate script that tries to run content on the same media player, the system is smart enough to identify that no, you can't run those two scripts at the same time because only one piece of content can be running on any one DMP at a time. The validation tab will actually show you where those conflicts are. So if you have two scripts that are in conflict with each other, those details will show up here. Additionally, it'll show you warnings related to individual script states and whether or not they have content assigned. So let's say you had a really big and complicated script with a lot of individual playlists assigned to different parts of the screen. What this will do is it'll actually let you say, I forgot to assign a playlist to this specific action. It'll show up here in your validation errors. You can know exactly where to go to resolve that problem for that particular script. Next up, let's look at the event management tab. This is what Brandon was just talking about a little while ago. So if we move again from script management to event management, this does typically open in a new tab. You'll note that SoFi has a lot of stuff scheduled on this management dashboard, mostly because there are a lot of things that need to run every day. This applies to the Allegiant venue, it applies to SoFi. You'll note that there are encoders that start up and stop every day. There's wayfinding signage that starts and stops every day. But we can actually jump in and take a look at just one of these. So if you ever want to add or edit anything in Event Manager, it involves a double click. So if we take the daily encoder script, we can double click. We can either edit just this one appearance, or we can edit the entire series of appearances. And so what you'll see here, there's an event name associated with the script. You pick the script that you want to run. So when you go into select script and do this dropdown, this will show you every script that has been configured in your system. You'll pick the one that you want to run. You'll identify whether or not you want that event to repeat. In other words, do you want it to occur multiple days in a row? How many days in a row? Do you want it to occur every week? What's the timing? And a couple of the other details that you see here. The options for running a script involve proof of play, staging, and force stop. Proof of play means that as a script runs, it generates a confirmation of the individual files that run on your DMP. So if you have advertising sponsors or somebody who's trying to track that a particular piece of content runs regularly, this makes sure that that content generates a record that can be used to export proof of play data that you can then format and send along to whoever has a requirement for that documentation. Staging is really important. The staging button, if this isn't selected for a script, it means that the DMP is only going to play content that has already been staged to that player. So a really good example. So if you look at the demo screen that we've got running right now, that graphic is actually loaded locally onto the DMP. So when we run the script and we have that staging tag activated, what it says is every piece of content that's in a playlist that's assigned to an action in a script for that DMP, that content gets pushed out to the DMP at the time that it stages. If you don't run staging, but you've changed your playlists and added or removed graphics, removing is fine. It doesn't really care. But if you add something new to the playlist and don't stage it, when the DMP gets to that asset in the playlist, it'll be black. It'll just be empty content. It won't actually play the asset. So unless you know that you haven't actually updated your playlist before you run a script, running staging is typically a good idea. Now, the only time that I would recommend that you wouldn't need to stage, if you've taken a script down to make an adjustment that doesn't involve updating playlists, and you want the script to start faster, you can definitely do that without staging, because it won't go through the process of checking to see if every media player in your script actually has every piece of content. It'll just run it immediately.
Sorry.
Yeah.
By default, though, staging is always unchecked, right?
Correct.
Is there any way to make it so it's by default checked? Because it seems like that's what you normally want.
That's a great question, and the answer is no. A lot of the default behaviors can't be modified. Anything that can, we'll talk about when we get into the system configuration tab, but for sure, the default is always going to be that staging is unchecked, and you have to manually check it. And that applies not just here in the scheduler, but even if you run a script from the script management tab, right? Last thing is force stop. Force stop just tells this scheduled instance of the script that when it gets to the end time, the second half of the time period, that the script should stop itself. If you don't select that, the script will actually just keep running when you get to the end of the timer. I've never encountered a situation where you didn't want the script to stop when you schedule it. The only thing I can think of off the top of my head is baseball, for example, where you don't necessarily know when the end of the game is going to be. You might want to schedule it and not include a force stop, but that's typically not applicable to either of the environments that any of you guys are working with.
And force stop is on by default.
Force stop is on by default, yes. And then finally, scheduled states. This is one of the things we were talking about earlier. So if you click on scheduled states, you can actually set a timer for each one of those individual states. So here, it starts with 1 by default once you turn it on. If you click on the drop-down, it'll show you all of the states that are configured in that script, and you can pick the one that you want to run, you can set a time for it, and you can add multiples. And in fact, if you had, you can only have up to the total number of states that there are in a script. So for example, you couldn't have it scheduled to go from like the encoding state to the blank state and then back to the encoding state and then back to the blank state. It maxes out at the number of states in the script. The system status tab is just a general overview of the status of the system. So CPU utilization, memory utilization, storage, and some general summaries of the health and status of your DMPs. It'll show you your totals, the devices that are reachable, the devices that are non-compliant. It's just a good general overview of the health and the status of your system. You can also look at the status of the individual services that are running in Cisco Vision. For both of your environments, you'll notice that the CUCM server is red. There is a method for controlling DMPs using Cisco IP phones. It doesn't actually apply to newer models of IP phone. It's specifically to the Cisco 7975G, which is an older model. I would expect this will always be red in almost every venue that isn't running that legacy control. But the expectation should be that all of the rest of these services are up and green. If you ever log into this page and you say things are not responding correctly, if I'm sending controls to the server, the DMPs aren't doing what I want them to do, this is a good first place to check. Just make sure that the status of the server is green, that the CPU is not totally pegged, and that all of the services are running. This also gives you a quick place where you can do a restart of those services, because you'll notice that you can get the status and you can poll everything. Next up, we have Designer. So the Designer tab is used for two things. One is to build new templates for your media players, and the other one is to build widgets, which is a way that you can take in dynamic text from external sources and then render it on your screen. So we're going to start with templates, and we'll do a real deep dive on this later, but I just want to give you a general overview. So there are several templates that come stock with Cisco Vision. Those can't be modified or changed at all, but they're present on every system. So the standard 3-region LWrapper, for example, we can hit the edit button to take a look at it. You can see we have a video region, and we have 2 non-video regions. In this case, every media player can have at least a single video region, but some can actually render 2. So there are a variety of DMP types that are supported in Cisco Vision, Series 2, Series 3, and Series 4 players currently. In each one of those series, there are 2 different models. There's essentially a 1080 model and a 4K model. In the 4K model, if you're running 1080p content, you can run multiple video regions. You can run 2. If you're running the 1080p model, you can only run a single video region. It has to be 1080. Another big note is the model numbers are pretty similar. I think in your case, SoFi for sure, I know you're all UHD2s. So those are Series 4 players, and that's the 4K version of the player. I'm pretty sure that in Allegiant, you're also all UHD2s. But just as a note, if you purchase more DMPs in the future, there's an HD2 and a UHD2. The HD2 is the 1080 only, and that one can't run a second video region. It can only run a single video region. So it's worth making a note, again, in both of these environments, all the templates that have been created and pre-populated in your systems presume that you're running UHD2s, but if you start adding more media players of different versions, you can create a tag in the name for your template that just says whether it can run on a UHD2 or an HD2.
Since we're on two video regions,
Yeah.
what do you mean by two video regions? So I can, how I'm understanding, I can put up two images on one.
So there are a bunch of different applications, and when we come back in to really deep dive in a template, we'll talk about that application. But I'll show you it's just part of the overview. If we look at the template on the left-hand side, you'll see that we have three options for the template. We have a non-video region, we have a primary video region, and we have a secondary video region. What it means is, functionally, you can lay that video out however you want to. So a classic example would be like picture-in-picture, right? Really, really simple. Your primary video region is a multicast that you want to run in the background, and then you want to lay a second channel on top of it. That picture-in-picture is primary, secondary. But it also has other applications. For example, if you wanted to do an animated L wrapper that overlaid on top of your video region, doing that, you would actually have a secondary video region that was full screen, so that when you render your content and you build those L wrappers, you have a region that's expected to be transparent. In Cisco Vision 6.3, that's done through specifically a Luma key, so it's based on the brightness of the background. You can pick a brightness range that gets keyed out, and that leaves behind the L wrapper. And we're going to take a look at a couple of examples of what those can look like and what you can do with them. But that's the main application for the secondary video region. The other piece where it applies, and this applies to SoFi specifically, but could apply potentially anywhere, your menu board solution is a really, really great application of using two video regions. Because the templates are asymmetrical and every individual screen above a concession header has a different template, some of those templates are going to want part of a multicast feed and part of a menu board. Since the menu boards run in HTML, right, it's just a URL, that actually would be either a primary or a secondary video region. So if you want like part of the border of a presentation to extend across multiple screens, that's another really good application of a secondary video region. And we can also dig into, I can show you examples of what those like per concession header templates look like and how that applies, and I think it'll clarify a little bit some of what I'm talking about here. Just general notes, for each of these regions, all of the properties that you see on the right really are about how big is the region and then where does it render, right? What is its origin, you know? And that's really, in this case, because there's a fixed size for this L wrapper, 296 by 914, that means that we have to bring in the video region, which is why the video region is shrunk to 1624 by 914. And another quick note, the primary video region will always automatically scale multicast content to the appropriate size of the region, which the secondary video region will not. The secondary region, it wants to render at whatever size you've set the region to. Now we're going to take a quick look at widgets. So the widget editor is just a way for you to really take and create dynamic text from either fixed sources like RSS feeds, JSON files, or other data sources, and render them on screen. This application is a little bit limited in what it can do from a rendering perspective. In other words, you can't like do fade effects, you can't do scroll effects. You can cycle through individual items, or for example, if you're bringing in stat feeds, like GSys data, for example, that can be rendered in real time. But you don't really have a lot of options in terms of visualization. You can update the typefaces that the system uses, and when we get into looking at the software management tab, that's where we'll typically be uploading fonts, and those fonts will apply specifically to the widget editor. And these, just like templates, can be assigned as script actions. So in both cases, not just the template editor, but also for the widget editor, once you create something here, it becomes available for you to assign to a script state. And that's really the whole piece of this. Finally, a quick overview of the configuration tab. So the configuration tab is where all of the system's configuration data is maintained. This is where your DMP configurations, your location configurations, your channels, channel guides, groups, zones, luxury suites, all of that gets managed here. So depending on the operations in your facility, this is where we start blurring the line a little bit between information technology and broadcast. Almost everything else that we've looked at so far really falls directly into, this is IPTV management, this is broadcast. The system configuration blurs that line a little bit. We will get in and deep dive each of these configuration tabs as we go in, but as a general overview, the top left, the first icon is venues. This is a way for you to carve up your facility into a number of sub-venues if necessary. That allows you to say, if you had like clubhouses, for example, so the locker rooms for HQ. If you wanted the HQ staff if you wanted the locker room staff to manage those completely independently, you can create users that have access only to those DMPs, assign them to a sub-venue, and then all of a sudden, the only people who have access to those devices they manage it entirely for themselves. You can also create different default content for your sub-venues. You don't have to use it this way. Every DMP that registers to the system by default registers to no venue, but in your case you'll note that all of the performance venue and the MU4 DMPs are specifically associated with performance venue and MU4. You can also tag content and build playlists that apply only to one of these sub-venues. And by doing that, you restrict access only to people who are either venue operators for that venue or to general system administrators. Users, exactly what you would expect. This is where you can create and manage all of your system users and assign them appropriate permissions. Devices has a lot going on. This is where your individual locations and DMPs are configured and where you can quickly look up how they're configured. Location and DMP mapping is where you actually take the assigned locations and associate them with a media player to make them functional. IP phones will not apply for either of your environments, so you can ignore that. Local control also probably won't apply. This typically is associated with third-party control applications that don't use the published API. We'll talk a little bit about the API. We'll get into like real details about how that functions tomorrow. But again, both of these tabs you can really ignore. And display specifications, this is where you can set the configuration for a particular TV type. So typically there is a display spec for every model of TV, which is really useful for two things. One is it makes sure that you've got the correct configuration for a very specific type of TV. And it also means that for every location, you're also tracking the TV model in just that location. It's just a really useful way to store information. Groups and zones. This is how you can associate individual locations with groups, and where you can associate those groups with zones, which allow you to then script those locations. Just quickly take a look at our demo group. So you can, again, all of these individual tabs are fully searchable. So whatever you want to put in here, in this case, we're searching demo because all of our demo content is tagged with that name. You can take a look at the DMPs that are currently assigned to that group. There's our demo location. We'll show you the same details that you expect to see. And the same thing goes for zone associations. So we can take a look at the demo group. We know that the demo group has been assigned to a zone and only one zone. It's another really good way of quickly troubleshooting if you think you have a problem with the script. Something's not running content that you expect it to. Looking at your groups and zones is a quick way of saying, okay, yeah, the DMP I think is in this group is actually in this group, and that group is actually in the zone, and the action should be applying. Luxury suites. Luxury suites are how we group individual DMPs for API control and how we control what channel guides those individual DMPs get. So in this case, we've created a demo suite just for this DMP. You'll note that you can look at the assigned locations. We just have the one. These all have a logical ID. And then if we go into user TV control, you'll see that there's a fixed and a visitor pin that can be generated here for each. This pin number is what all of the control actually authenticates against. So when you're sending a control out to the Cisco Vision API, this is the pin that lets the system know what devices you should or shouldn't have control over. And then channel guide. This shows you the association for which channel guide applies to what TV. Channel definitions. This is where all of your individual multicast streams are identified. So for example, we'll take a look at Fox Sports 1. So what you'll find is that the multicast configuration for your video channel lives here. The address, the port, the channel number, identifying names. So for example, when you change channels on your DMP, what pops up on the banner, this is where all of that is configured. This is also how you would define a URL channel. So for example, menu boards, your coach schedule application, all those types of things live here as channels. So we can take a look at this demo menu, for example. Very much the same structure as a multicast channel, only instead of it having a group address and a port, it just has a URL. This is also very helpful because you can run a quick test that'll return whether or not that URL successfully will be rendered by the DMP. It does a quick check of the code of the site and says, hey, can I actually do anything with the thing that you're pointing me to? Separately, DMP encoding profiles. At HQ, I don't think you have any encoder DMPs, but at Allegiant you do in the stadium, and you have a couple of DMPs that are also running as well for local content. You can create DMP encoding profiles. So in other words, you can set up what you want the output to be, whether you want it to be 1080, whether you want it to be 720, frame rate, and a couple of things. Typically, the three that come stock are all you really need to run, but you can modify these so that you have a variety of different presets. And if we look at the master channel list, we can actually identify a DMP encoded channel. There we go. So Brandon, so channel 200 is your level 2 South Hall of Fame Club DMP. With DMP encoded selected, you'll note that it has the ability to select a profile, and that's out of the profiles that are defined in the DMP encoding piece. And once that's set as a DMP encoded channel, you can actually script, and you'll note that in your schedule for SoFi, you have a daily encoder script that runs. All the DMP encoded channels can be set as a start and stopped streaming. Channels themselves can be amalgamated into channel guides. You can create as many of these as you want. And again, those are assigned in luxury suites. So from here, with luxury suites available, you can pick. So we've created a demo channel guide for the purposes of just showing an assignment. But we've added whatever channels we want to show up in that location. Let's say, for example, that we no longer wanted the menus or any of the in-house channels to show up. We could simply remove those from the channel guide, and that DMP can no longer tune those channels, as long as this channel guide is what's associated with that luxury suite. Any DMP not in a luxury suite will automatically get the default channel guide. Really important to remember. Data integration. So the data integration tab is where you can take those external data sources, GSYS, RSS, XML, JSON, and actually parse those sources in. So whatever your external data source is, you can create a data source by type. So for example, here's GSYS, NFL, and clock. Create the source, give it a name. And then you'll see the field mapping based on the structure of the actual data. So with GSIS, you'll see the game clock. Here's all of the data as structured. It's a standardized type of data. So if you're using a data source that already exists as a data type in Cisco Vision, you don't have to worry about any of the input field mapping. You can just pass out whatever variables you want to see. So for example, you can move clock time to the output field, and you can pass it through exactly as it is. And now, that data is available for you to use in any widget. And we'll take a little bit more into this later. Proof of play. We mentioned before that if you run a script with proof of play, it'll generate proof of play documentation. This is where that actually lives. So if we go to our site signage non-wayfinding script, on the left-hand side, we can just click on the report, detailed and summary, and download those reports. Those are in a CSV format, so you typically open them in Excel, and often they're a little bit dense and difficult to read, but what you're really looking at when you open up a proof of play file is a particular DMP by its name and IP address, and then what piece of content played and at what timestamp. So once you have that exported, it's sort of up to you to how you want to take the data and present it and visualize it. Triggers. Triggers are ways that you can either externally send in a control message to Cisco Vision from some other system to ask it to do something, or you can have a control message from Cisco Vision sent out based on a particular action occurring. We've got a couple of these set up to show in the demo, but the long and short is, if you want to be able to integrate with your broadcast control systems, this is a great way to do it. If you wanted to be able to build triggers for your system that run in third-party applications like an iOS app or a web app, this is a great way to do that. And it's also a really good way for you to be able to chain actions, so if you had multiple scripts that you want to trigger off of each other, you can actually build all of that in these input and output triggers as well. This TV off configuration, there is basically an all off button that can be configured for your venues. Any DMP, any group that is assigned here will be powered off when you hit that button. So for example, if we were to take our demo group and assign it and save, now if we hit the all off button, those zones will power off. I don't see this used very much, but it's worth going over. And now the system configuration tab. There is a lot of stuff going on in these tabs, and we're going to spend some time really going through it and talking about what all of this stuff means. Typically your systems are commissioned so that all of the configuration is complete by the time you're operating it. That does apply for all of your venues, but it is useful to know where to go looking for certain things. So when we do a deep dive here, that'll be very useful for you to know where that configuration lives. Couple more things in our tour of the system before we do our first break. So if we go in, here's our turn TVs off button. We're not going to hit that at all because there's no reason to. But literally from that drop down, you hit turn TVs off, you hit OK, everything powers off. That is configured in the TV off configuration page. System state report. If you have an open case with Cisco TAC, this is almost always the first place that they're going to want you to start. These are basically exports of all of the system's logs and the current state of the system at the time that you run it. These reports are a great way to start troubleshooting, but they are very dense. Typically, they're only looked at by engineers or by TAC folks. But you can find a lot of information. Again, we talked about the fact that users get tagged for everything that they do under their username. This is where that information lives. So if you need to really dig into what's happened in your system, this is where you can find it. And you can generate not just a general system status report, but you can do a full export of all logs. You can download them or you can show them in your browser. And the last thing to touch on fairly quickly, manage software. This is where your media player's firmware, upgrade packs, languages, fonts, certificates if you're trying to update. Ron, I know that's going to apply to you. And default images for your system. Basically anything that pertains to importing or exporting non-content files, that typically lives in this software management page. Now, this is also where you can manage your backups. So you can see the system backups that have been taken So in this case, you're configured for 7 days worth of backups. You can see that all those backups have been created and live on the server here. And a log for a backup if you run one. Licensing will also show you the compliance of your system. In this version of Cisco Vision, there's really no license enforcement. So if you're out of compliance, it's typically not a major issue. The real point is just to make sure that your system has been authorized against a smart license account. So like for HQ, for example, this is, I think, an outstanding issue that you and Louise have to have a conversation about, because I don't think a token's been generated to register the system. And at some point, it is going to probably start balking at you. So you can create a new default login screen for Cisco Vision, a new DMP background. That's the graphic that shows up when a DMP joins a script or reboots. And then the channel guide can also be customized. And that is basically a full tour of everything that lives in the Cisco Vision GUI you've got access to. So any general overview questions so far? I know for some of you, it's we're retreading a little bit of water.
What determines your DMP health?
Whether or not it is pingable by the system, and whether or not it's actively running a bootload file. So if the DMP's gone red, it usually means, almost all the time, it's a network connectivity issue. That's typically the only reason that it would be in a bad state. If for some reason if you have a DMP that hasn't rebooted after a configuration change that points it to a new version of firmware, it'll also show up red because it's not compliant. When you reboot that DMP, it'll make itself compliant by the time it comes back up, unless it has a connectivity problem. But I'd say 95% of the time, that red light means that it's not on the network.
You were saying like a softball thing, but the DMP is encoded, and
Yeah.
as I'm walking to that panel, I can actually select DMP encoder on that panel, and it'll tune to 200.
Correct. And I don't think it applies in HQ, but basically, if you have got a club space that has an HDMI input on a wall plate, and that is not going directly to a Crestron system for distribution because you want to put it out on non-Crestron fed DMPs. Basically, your HDMI input source goes to the in on a DMP, and I'll show you right here real quick. So on your CVU HD2s, you actually have 2 HDMI ports. There's an out port and an in port. The in port is really just used for encoding. So the idea is wall plate, connect the device, wall plate goes to an input on the DMP, and then you run a script to start that DMP encoding the HDMI input onto a multicast channel. So that's what that script is really doing. It's just stopping and starting the multicast channel every day. Because over time, these aren't dedicated encoding appliances. They can encode. And as a best practice, we stop and start that encoding action every day to make sure that it's stable. So.